Welcome to Not Top Secret, a podcast about all things paranormal, conspiracies, and out of this world. From UFO sightings and alien encounters to government cover-ups and mysterious phenomena, we'll leave no stone unturned in our search for the truth. So grab your tinfoil hat and join us on our journey into the weird, the strange, and the just plain bizarre. This is Not Top Secret with your hosts, Josh and Aaron. Welcome to episode 1 of Not Top Secret. I'm your host, Aaron. And this is your host.
Co-host, Josh. I'll be the co-host.
So, we got a few things we're going to talk about today. First one, give me where this kind of started from, why we're doing this podcast here. And I will dive into it on my side of it. I have kind of always had a fascination with UAPs, or at the time when it was UFOs, that was the term for it. And that's what I was always drawn to. And I guess I grew up watching all the good alien movies as a kid, and Close Encounters being one of my favorite movies. How many times I've watched it. And I think that always kind of attracted to me growing up here in Wyoming because of Devil's Tower.
Right.
So when he's carving up Devil's Tower in the mashed potatoes, I think every kid wanted to carve up Devil's Tower in their mashed potatoes at Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
So that was kind of what drove my slight obsession with it. It's not a full obsession, but then it kind of kicked off more so in the recent years with kind of like the releases of the videos with the Tic Tac videos, the gimbal, and then I kind of let it go for a little while there, and then I met you, and that was when my interest kind of revived, because I was like, man, I don't feel like such a loner anymore.
Yeah.
There's other people out there who actually care about this. So then there was kind of opened my eyes to a whole world of people who actually cared about it, with UFO Twitter and stuff like that. That was something I never really got involved in, never got involved in Twitter. So I had no idea that was a thing. But
Yeah, Josh, I've been fascinated with this topic since probably the 90s. I think probably the earliest trace of it would be coming across the X-Files. Like anybody, popular media is really influential to people's personal interests. So it started from there, and then another earliest memory, probably a documentary from that same era called Dreamland Area 51, is done by this guy, Bruce Burgess. He goes out there and basically talks about the Lazar story, talks about Area 51. It's pretty derivative nowadays when you look back at Area 51 documentaries, but they had some really interesting tidbits in there when you go back and revisit it. It's kind of difficult to come across, but you can probably find it on YouTube. It's a good point of interest there. Becomes a bit of an obsession. This is still kind of early internet. You start becoming familiar with things like Roswell, Phoenix Lights in 97, the kind of historical incidents from there. And then it kind of falls off as life and career kind of take over. And then every 5-10 years or so, I kind of go, hey, what's going on with UFOs and whatnot? And then around 2011, when we got back from Afghanistan, I was working late night somewhere, and somehow, I don't remember exactly what, I remember just hearing kind of rumors. Oddly enough, I'd never listened to Coast, never listened to Dreamland at that point with Art Bell. But I had come across Coast to Coast as being a famous kind of late night listen. So I was working graveyard and started coming across that, listened to those new George Norrie episodes. And then at some point they referenced Disclosure Project, was something I had no frame of reference of at the time, which was Stephen Greer's project in about 2001, where he had all these firsthand military witnesses that came through. They had a press conference at the National Press Club in D.C. They kind of go through their encounters, whether it be at nuclear missile silos or people that worked at NASA and had alleged they'd seen pictures of things that were ultimately photoshopped out or edited out, airbrushed, whether it be structures on the moon and everything like that. Anyway, piqued the interest again. It was super compelling to hear that all in like the totality. It really reinvigorated the interest, and probably for the last, now it's going to be, 12, 13 years. Pretty consistent obsession, and thankfully, as we're participating now with podcasts, that was a huge influence. Going through, listening to a lot of old programs, whether it be one of my personal favorites, Radio Mysterioso by Greg Bishop, who had a great book called Project Beta. It's been a long-term obsession that kind of wanes with the availability of information. And then obviously, like most people probably nowadays, they're most familiar with UAP history following December 2017, the famous New York Times cover story, Glowing Auras and Black Money, the Pentagon's secret UFO program, which is kind of a misnomer. I mean, it's technically secret, but it's a good kind of entry point for the average person into the topic. And I think based on the totality of the history, it's one of the most significant moments in this topic's history, at least from an official perspective, because it's really the first time ever the government has publicly acknowledged the existence of something anomalous that's flying. Throughout all history of the U.S. government, it's always been flatly and blatantly denied. I go back to press conferences from the 50s where they'd say, hey, there's nothing to be afraid of, there's nothing to hide at all. And there was early conflict in the 50s and 60s between, namely in the 50s, you had Donald Kehoe, who was I believe he was a major for the Marine Corps, and then he got out and he was making really strong allegations that the government basically had more information on this topic than they were leading the public to believe. Anyway, December 2017, highly significant. And now it's January 15th, 2023. It's a couple days past the second ODNI report on the topic. You just had the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2023 that came through, which had famously, they become affectionately known as whistleblower provisions, which we'll talk about briefly, as well as the ODNI report, which is unsurprisingly underwhelming, but also an important step in the right direction.
Yeah, that's a brief conversation.
Yeah.
It doesn't go very far because there's nothing there to go far with.
Yeah. I mean, NDA provisions is really like 4 or 5 paragraphs of actual content in a 1,000-page plus document of just Kafka-esque legalese. The main kind of takeaways from this provision, if you want to find it yourself, you can look up the NDA 2023, and you can just Control F and find. If you just type in unidentified, you'll find the section, but it's also section 1663. The main things to take away from here is that I think most people, including myself, when they first hear of whistleblower protections, they think, okay, this is the moment. This is disclosure with a capital D. This is where all the people from the black world will come out and tell all the dirty secrets from the last 70 plus years. Well, that's not entirely the case. There's an element of there that's accurate. And this basically allows for historical re-examination, people that have involved in current and legacy projects as they come to be known, to kind of come forward in a classified setting and brief Congress on what they may have known or been involved with. And this is where your personal involvement in politics can be very influential, referencing your representatives and telling them this is an important topic, that this is something you have some interest in, this is something that does have validity to the public consciousness, can really be influential, even if your particular representative isn't a member of these councils or commissions.
Right. It's not that that the whistleblower protections necessarily say, okay, well, we're just going to learn everything. Everything's going to be told to us. This just kind of opens the door for those procedures to happen, for people to be able to come up and say, hey, back in 1988, I was working at this factory doing this, and I saw this blueprint, and it was about this or whatever. It gives people to do the Bob Lazar moment without doing the Bob Lazar, you know, and so it's not necessarily that it's going to just change everything, but it opens those doors to get those people in front of Congress, and then it will be on Congress themselves to be the ones who say, hey, no, we need to look further into this matter. We have it on this authority, or this person said this. Yeah. We need to look forward to this. And then that's where they'll go forth with that. So it's not that it necessarily is just going to open everything up to everybody. Right. Most of that stuff is still classified and will remain classified, but it opens that door and it gets the conversation going. And that's the biggest thing, is getting this conversation going, because we had gone, 50 years or 50 something years without having even a congressional meeting on UFOs or UAP. That was,
I think it was the 70s. It was Gerald Ford's administration. It was the last time they had a public hearing on UFOs. And again, the one we had was 2021, and that was a dud, to say the least. Obviously, they had a couple kind of PR type folks up front that had no frame of reference of this topic whatsoever, which is kind of the repeating theme when you have someone that speaks public from a governmental perspective on this topic. It's very much from a point of kind of reasonableness, to be fair. Like, they're very much, nobody wants to be wrong on this. Nobody wants to go forward and come out and say, hey, it's space aliens or it's interdimensional, demons or whatever the multitude of theories might align with. So I think that people that are career-minded are very, very cautious with this, especially with the stigma. Oh, yeah. It still echoes from the last 75 years, because that's a whole separate topic. The stigma, how it sounds very conspiratorial to say how it was developed, because it gives the idea of a kind of a key control group that might be influencing these types of things. And then you get toward that kind of really kind of edgelord conspiratorial nonsense. But the problem is there's a lot of validity to a lot of those elements. Disinformation is a real thing. Disinformation, counter intel, all those types of things are real, which gives people legitimate skepticism when you hear someone like Lou Elizondo, who I know I'm a fan of what he's done, because it's, even from a counter intel perspective, bringing the topic forward as he's been a key element of, is exceptionally important.
Yeah, that's not Doty who's going after, one man and, or, one woman and trying to manipulate
Right.
or influence or disinform their status, their goal. This is a guy who's coming out to the mass.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, even if he was not what he says, it wasn't in his benefit. It's more in the benefit of the side of the people who are interested in this subject, even if they're not people who consider themselves ufologists or anything like that. It's in their benefit because it brought that to the public mind, and it's brought it enough to the public mind that this has become, it's going to Congress, and Congress is getting involved in it, and this is becoming a regularly seen thing on the news. You got like Tucker Carlson and people like that who are going out and they're doing specials on these things because that's it's a big deal, and it's coming to light for not just the American people, but for people all over the world. And there's lots of people that were waiting on the NDAA to pass outside of the U.S. because they know that they're not getting any of that disclosure that they want from their own countries. Maybe their countries don't have anything, but there is that common consensus and that agreement that the U.S. does have those things, that there is something there. Whether, it's always that argument of what it is. Is there that crash? Is the Roswell, and all these things going back, but there is that agreement amongst most people. There is something, whether, whatever it is still something.
I think that's at least my overarching thesis, is that we don't really have the luxury of disbelief anymore. And I think in this field specifically, I have kind of a conservative perspective on it all, because again, like anyone else, no one likes to be wrong or proved wrong or any of that type of thing. And it's not about putting forth my beliefs or our beliefs only, just based on the totality of everything I've listened to. I have a particular fascination from again, from a media perspective, the Star Trek angle, right? It's the craft itself, who's the pilot, etc. So the physical craft, even if that's an adequate descriptor of what these things are, even if that's an adequate descriptor of it, that's the part that interests me the most. Again, there's a cliche with this field of it being a rabbit hole, which is not really a cliche at all. It's the God's honest truth is when you jump in with both feet, it gets really weird really fast. And it's really hard on your personal paradigm to kind of accept a lot of these prevailing theories that come there.
Absolutely.
Whether it be, the parapsychology stuff, whether it be the interdimensional stuff, whether it be even just the breakthrough physics stuff. You'll hear mainstream physicists talk about how these types of distances across, space-time are too great to be possibly traversed by any sense of physics that we currently understand, which is basically just the way I understand it, the kind of Einsteinian model. The faster you get to the speed of light, the infinitely more mass that something projects, and then it becomes basically a point where you can't reach anything faster, therefore light years being the key descriptor. But I'm not a physics major, so we're not going to try and sound like an idiot there.
By the way, I'm just going to put a disclosure in there. We're not experts on anything.
No.
I barely get my own pants on every day. So, we're not experts. We're just really into the subject. And it's not just the UAP subject. It's just that there's more out there to life than is commonly known. And we have that tendency as people to just kind of put our heads in the sand, and if it doesn't affect us directly, what's the deal, And I've heard that with the UAP subject, is people who their belief on it is that basically, and that's it, because it's baffling to me, like how they exist now. The government's saying, hey, no, look, this is we have these videos, they were leaked, but we're going to confirm it, they were real. There's something out there. There is something, and I'm always like, why? How can people not just care about this? I even my own spouse do the same thing. Like, how do you not care? And then I kind of get that same response back from everybody. It's not that it's not that I don't care. The response is always more along the lines of I can't change it, and I'm not going to find anything out on my own. The only way it's going to happen is if they're that whole landing on the White House lawn idea is how that's going to make a difference to them. And then it's like, well, at what point does it change my life and affect my life? So there's that. But yeah.
Yeah, circling back to kind of government representation, I think most mainstream people, and myself included, will look toward that, even in a divided time like this, kind of going, this is an official stance on this issue, and that's really significant. And it remains to be significant because those types of institutions still try to retain some form of credibility. So, with that being said, agree or disagree with kind of their motives, I think really the kind of key people to really pay attention to, even from just a layman perspective, are going to be Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon. Both will speak very precisely. If you go through and watch like a history of their public presentations, there's a great YouTube channel called Red Panda Koala. He does a couple kind of timelines of UFO disclosure efforts, and there'll be kind of a compilation of these public appearances, whether it be on a mainstream news outlet or some type of public forum, and you'll hear both Lou and Chris Mellon speak very, very precisely, where it's very clear that they're trying to be respectful of their security oaths and elements of that. So yeah, key people to pay attention to, but that goes without saying, even if you have a tertiary interest in this topic, those names are going to be nothing new to you. Following up on that, so the NDA provisions specifically allow for people from historical and legacy programs to come forward and kind of speak to Congress in a classified setting to speak about what they've been involved with. Without being melodramatic, everybody knows Congress leaks like a sieve. So even from just a kind of looky-loo perspective, the more Congress knows, the more we'll ultimately end up knowing, even if it's through unofficial means, whether it be leaks and whatnot. So from just a pure fascination perspective, that's significant. The other half of significant events is the second ODNI report. Again, not to be melodramatic, but mostly a dud. If you've looked through it, it's 12 pages, and 11 and a half of them are government bullshit. They're just a lot of fluff, a lot of things of how they approach the subject and whatnot. And I can appreciate folks that aren't super familiar with the topic appreciating kind of, hey, here's what we did, here's how we did it, here's the goal, here's what we were tasked with, etc.
And on that, if you're not super clear with the topic, the ODNI report, it was the Office of
The
Director of National Intelligence. Yeah. And they were ordered by Congress to have a report provided by October 31st of 2022 to basically show where we were since that initial hearing back in June, where we were with the development of the Office of Aero and stuff like that. And that report obviously came out late, very, very late. You know, it took us all the way until January to get the report. So it is not a huge report. There is a classified version of it that went forth before Congress for them to review. And from what I've read, it is about 80 pages or so. Yeah. And how many pages did we say this one is? 12 pages. So it's been dumbed down, narrowed down. And what's there is in that term of kind of a flop. It does kind of tell you how they got to where they're at, why they're creating the report, and how many different observations that they have, and how many observations they've already gone over. Outside of that, there's not much information there.
Yeah, I think the key takeaways, which you've probably seen if you follow this topic, are the volume of reports that they're showing. I think right here it shows the quote, totals 510 UAP reports as of 30th of August 2022, which is substantially more than the initial report. I don't have the number in front of me. But just the acknowledgement of the volume of these reports over a period of a couple of years is, again, really significant. Not to discredit the possibilities of normal things, whether it be, Chinese, Russian drones, all that type of thing, space trash, all the things that were kind of joked about prior to this coming out. Those are all legitimate explanations for things that people might see. I mean, there's always a possibility that there was some breakthrough that was done here through our normal kind of technological innovations. But, and this is the big but in the room, is that what about 1940s?
Right.
What about everything that's been seen through, as the phrase has been come to known as credible observers, people that are trained at acknowledging and identifying other types of aircraft that they see. I mean, pilots are among your best, especially military pilots, not because the military is something fantastic, but that these are highly, highly trained experts.
Yeah, we're not putting Joe Schmo in the cockpit of an F-22 or anything like that, or an F-16 or F-18s. We got these guys who are flying these things, and these are guys who they've made a career out of their flight and out of their job, and their job comes down to our national security. It comes down to the defense, and they take their job very seriously. And so when you have these guys coming forward, like
Dave Fravor.
Dave Fravor. When we have like Dave Fravor and Alex, I'm probably going to butcher her name, but I think it was Dietrich.
Yeah, Dietrich. Yeah.
So when we have people like that coming forward, where these are very skilled, successful pilots, and they're saying, "Hey, no, look, this is what we saw. We know what we saw."
Mm-hmm.
That's a big deal. But you're right. We have to go back to there's that 1947s, 1945, even when you go all the way back into the World War II side of it, where these guys were seeing where we have the Foo Fighters.
Yep.
And I believe that is why Arrow was originally, so Arrow was only supposed to go back to, I believe, 1947 on their reviews of data, and they changed it, and it's going back to 1945 there. So they're showing that, hey, look, no, we have even further data that we have documented that we can review. That didn't just come out of nowhere.
Right.
And they are taking this as a serious subject. And that's why this is, as people should take it as a serious subject, because the government's, they're notorious for throwing money at things that they don't need to throw money at. But I think that when it's coming to this is pretty serious to them.
Yeah. The 40s are exceptionally important when it comes to this. I mean, when you dive into this topic with any element of interest, invariably you'll find yourself in the Ancient Aliens area, not just the show, but just the concept. You'll find yourself in anything that goes prior to that. And there's certainly anomalous things from that era, things that most of us wouldn't understand or can theorize what they might represent. But in terms of modern history, that's where my personal interest kind of stems, is I think 47 is a really exceptional era. Kind of broadly speaking, since we're new here, so my general thesis, like I said before, is that it's presumptive that the phenomenon itself exists, which is something that wasn't really accepted until about 2017, because it was always fuzzy videos and kind of memed, Hicks out in the middle of nowhere saying that an alien came down and probed them at a barbecue or whatever it may be, which is always just a form of discrediting that. You never see a news story on a local news. They say, hey, there's a UFO in the sky. There was a long time there where you wouldn't see it with anything but spooky music or X-Files theme or anything like that.
Yeah, it's that X-Files theme. Everybody loves to throw, if there's a YouTube video, the X-Files theme is what's leading that video.
Yeah. There could be a lot of explanations for that, whether it's a conspiratorial mind to discredit the topic or it's just something where people associate that music with the topic. It's not always to be associated with being nefarious, but it has done its element of just kind of helping people dismiss it as fiction. So yeah, we don't have the luxury of disbelief, in my opinion. At some point during the early 20th century, most likely around 47, I think some exotic materials were recovered, exotic items. We'll talk about that probably most of the rest of this episode, which will focus primarily on Roswell. Their initial assessments of those items revealed an inability to understand and replicate that technology. I think there was a small, high-level group that was focused on the issue. Some people might know it as MJ-12. It might be known as something else. MJ-12 was a whole separate topic on its own. They were determined to keep it secret. And this is important to acknowledge in the period of the time. We're talking early Cold War. We're talking post-World War II. I obviously wasn't alive then, but based on kind of my historical understanding, the period of time was exceptionally tense. While there was relief for being out of the war, there was still that kind of looming Soviet threat. And I'm sure there was even pockets where they were still worried about a remnant of Nazi threat. That's where you get to talk about things like Operation High Jump.
Our look into Argentina, especially with the recent FOIA releases, where Argentina is a reoccurring trend of, hey, we know people went there. And we did know coming out of World War II that the next big fight was the Soviets. We didn't know how that fight would be fought.
Right.
Nobody in 1945 or 1946 could have predicted that. We knew, at that time, we knew, hey, it's the Soviets, it's going to be the Soviets. But nobody at that time could predict how it was going to happen.
Yeah.
So we didn't know it was going to turn into a Cold War situation where we just came out of a boots on the ground, where we were fighting, we had our big battles, and we were storming beaches, and we were doing those kinds of things, and we were taking back lost territories, and we were making moves. We didn't know that was how the Cold War was going to work out, that it was going to be more of a technological war with threats upon threats upon threats based off of the technology we were developing. But it was so important that's where we come into, you said, like Operation High Jump. I think another one that's important to look at is Operation Paperclip. Yep. We would not have pulled all those scientists back from Germany, some of them which we knew had committed some very, very severe things, some atrocious things. We would not have pulled those people. No. We wouldn't have brought the von Brauns back, even though they threw us decades into the future, because the Germans actually did know some of what they were doing. They were actually very technologically advanced because of war. And so I think that it's pretty important to know that when we have like Operation Paperclip, that was a big deal to the United States.
Yeah, those guys weren't Nazi adjacent. They were hardcore, high level SS type
Yeah, they weren't
scientists.
just, they like to make it out, people will, oh, they were just all scientists. And I'm sure that there was quite a few that were just scientists,
Yeah.
but there was a lot of them, a lot of very high ranking officials, people who were high up in the SS that we knew had done some really bad stuff. Some of these guys who were committing horrible testings at the death camps and such, and,
Yeah.
and they were using the forced labor to do their things. And you can go all the way into the theories or the conspiracies of like Die Glock, and the Nazi Bell, and those. We do know that those facilities were actually built. We don't know if the Bell itself existed, but we know that the facility was built, and it was built off of forced labor from the camps, and most of those people died doing that. So we know that they were involved in, even at that base level, some really bad stuff. And then we also know they were doing experiments and stuff like that. So these weren't just, they weren't your Joe Schmo scientists. No. They weren't your average Joes. These were important people.
Yeah. And I think an element of the Cold War that can't be ignored either is obviously the nuclear angle.
Oh, yes.
Being how World War II ended, that was like the elephant in the room. Is like the Soviets get it, you're primarily like next threat. At that point, they hadn't developed it. But
the Germans were close.
Yeah.
And we know that.
Yeah, and it's right around the corner for that threat. So now America put its cards on the table, ended the war pretty abruptly because of that. And so now that's the looming elephant in the room, which is obviously the whole element of the Cold War, which made it so tense for most people. Anyway, getting away from elementary American history. So yeah, you have your small, high-level focus group, most likely including some of your paperclip scientists, obviously based on the time period, looking to keep it mostly secret. It's initially held, again, this is all my opinion, it's initially held directly in military hands, right? There's not a real exceptional military industrial complex yet, right? The World War II is still kind of a joint effort between everybody in the States to start manufacturing planes, bullets, bombs, tanks, all that type of thing, where you see the famous propaganda posters of rationing nylon and rationing these types of items because the war effort needs it. But this is where that kind of really comes to fruition, the military industrial complex, with Eisenhower will reference in his famous speech, which I happen to think might have been a wink, wink, nudge, nudge to this topic. 1948, 1949, you have Project Sign and Project Grudge, respectively. They were secret at the time. Grudge, I think, was a little bit more forward-facing, but it was an effort to understand the phenomenon of the potential origin. I think these were set on by that recovery. So they recovered something. They realized that this topic, while it was also known of being the UFO wave of 1947, which gave them kind of a cover for that, famous first kind of mainstream understood sighting, Kenneth Arnold over Mount Rainier in Washington, where he saw several. And the odd misconception here is that they weren't actual saucers. They weren't circular discs. They were more like a delta-shaped wing.
Nine ships, though, of some sort. Yeah. 9 sort of craft.
Yeah, some floating like saucers on water, kind of skipping through the air, hence where that terminology came from. Anyway, Sign and Grudge, 1948, 1949, used to kind of understand the origin of these types of phenomenon. 1948, you have the creation of the U.S. Air Force, which was not only just a convenient militaristic strategy, but it was also good for compartmentalization. Around that time, I believe it was around September of 47, shortly after Roswell. Not necessarily widely thought to be directly associated with, because it's still post-World War II. You still needed to create these type of infrastructures, whether or not you build out the CIA, which happened at the same time, which used to be the OSS, which was really clear that we needed some type of international intelligence agency that had a clear compartmentalization for the information that they would gather. But it also, if this theory is accurate, provided an adequate kind of stovepipe for these types of information.
Which has led into how we handle information within the U.S. anyways, how we handle information within the military and the government in particular, is that stovepiping of information. Mm-hmm. And it really, before that, it wasn't really there.
No.
And then all of a sudden we have all these programs that get created, and we have these new organizations that are founded. And yes, the compartmentalization, it becomes prime, it's there, and the stovepiping just starts.
Yeah.
And, and like you said, all these things happened directly after 1947, which is when Roswell happened. Mm-hmm. And what we know of Roswell is varying. It's differing we have so many different reports of it from the Air Force themselves, who investigated it, has issued multiple differing reports to where their final one that came out not too long, I guess, 20 years ago. 1990s was their final report. But it's kind of interesting that all these things would just pop up in 1947. Yes, and we did. We learned a lot in World War II that was very important to us as to how we could better ourselves, how we could advance our military so that we didn't run into issues that we did run into while we were in the war. But it is very suspicious when you have Project Sign popping up in 1948 and Project Grudge popping up in 49. Those were projects that were actually specifically centered around the UFO incident that started with Roswell, or so we know it started with Roswell. And if the government didn't see that it was a issue at this time, those programs would have never existed. There was a public interest in it. There was a public interest from the get-go because of their initial reports at Roswell, which we'll get into, and then their redacted or changed reports at Roswell. But they could have just left it at that right there. They could have said, no, those reports were wrong, whatever. And I think that for the most part within the American public, that probably would have just gone away. Most people were just happy to have their loved ones back after the war. They weren't so focused on this as much. If they could have just, eventually it would have just, it turned the dust and just blown away. But the government then turns around and creates these projects. So the government was taking it seriously at that time. So if nothing was there, why create the projects? Why have Sign? Why have Grudge? Those that's a big sign right there. Not a pun.
Right. I think one quick note, when we say the government, we there's a clear understanding, at least between the two of us, that the government isn't one cohesive, accurately rolling, singular intended mechanism. It's just an easy turn of phrase to kind of reference a small kind of control group, where it's like, okay, the government element, the control group. We might use a different adjective in the future. I don't know.
Control group works really good. There's a stigma around MJ12 itself with all the documentation that came out with MJ12 and people trying to verify those reports. And there's been some kind of new developments in that recently, which were kind of cool. But, for the most part, there's kind of a stigma with it because the FBI, they came out right away and they're like, this is bogus. This is a hoax. In fact, the way they write it on their report that they received was bogus in giant letters. Looked like, a kid got a hold of a Sharpie on that report. And so there's that. You hear the MJ12, but there's also other names that you'll hear for it. And I think the way we kind of discuss it as the control group. There is a control group, and we know there is a control group. And to this day, there is still some sort of control group inside this subject. And we know that because of how hard it was to push through these things like the NDAA. It wasn't just political in nature of like, hey, we just want to not be partisan. We just want to screw things up. There's all sorts of, Lou Elizondo was running into people that he was having troubles with when he was saying, hey, we need to say stuff about this. We need to get this out to the public. And I don't know if there's that stigma. There's that group that has that stigma of it, that they don't like the subject. There's a religious side of it that, that people have been outspoken about. There is a large group that is a religious outside of it. They don't want to bring, because it changes things fundamentally for a lot of people within their own personal belief structures. And then there's probably that side of it, if we go into, which we'll talk about at a later time, is like the Davis documents when we get into the Wilson memos, that, hey, there's still a control group in here. When we have military and high-ranking government officials that are being stovepiped themselves, that they're not able to get into this stuff when they should be able to, there's still a control group.
I think that's the theme, and that'll come in important again when we come back to Roswell. With one of the most recent kind of popular books on the topic, is that even people that reference involvement with this, I think there's a good possibility that they're also lied to for the sake of the ultimate secret of whatever that is. And there's a certain irony to it as well, because if you ask anyone what's at Area 51, anybody's going to say that's where they keep the aliens, right? Unless they're like a grumpy skeptic type, where it's like they refuse to believe anything outstanding or phenomenal, or or I wouldn't even say it that dismissively. Some that's really driven by physical evidence. Most average people probably say, "Oh, that's where the aliens are at." I mean, it's referenced in movies like Independence Day. That's the only one that comes to mind. But specifically, even something like
and
that.
others, you can look them up on your own.
Yeah, exactly. But it's part of the public subconscious. If you reference that, that's where the aliens are.
Right. And if you spend any time, if you've been down there, I've been down to Roswell myself a few times. You've been down there, correct?
Yeah.
And so anytime you get down into that area, it's very apparent that is what that's the only tourist attraction. I mean, outside of Carlsbad, the caverns down there, that's the only tourist attraction down there. So is the aliens.
Yeah.
So
I mean, that to me, that's the ultimate irony. Is like, if that's the ultimate secret, if that's what's ultimately being behind closed doors or behind the green door at Wright-Patterson, it's still kind of in part of the public subconscious. So that also opens up the question: is it as simple as little grays? Is it as simple as biological entities from somewhere else? And that's where I get conflicted, because that's what I want to believe. But the more and more that you read into this, or just kind of listen to people that have adjacent associations with the topic, it's far more weird. It's potentially far more weird than just that.
And that's where we were talking, is that rabbit hole. When you get into that rabbit hole and you dive in with both feet, things start turning really fast.
Yeah.
And sometimes it does kind of start messing with your mind too, there, of trying to separate that of things that you know, things that are proven, things that you know and believe, or things that you just believe, and things that you've been told. And everybody's got their own view on this. This is very much one of those things that, 8 different people can be put in a room, and every single one of them is going to have a very different view.
I think that's probably one of my personal goals in agreeing to do this, is helping parse all the things that we've read or listened to over the years, come across, kind of absorbed around the topic, and trying to parse them into something cohesive, which so far in the first 20 minutes has been not very cohesive, but we're kind of just expressing interests, which is good.
And he says, agreed to do this because I forced him to do it.
Well, not agreed, but maybe agreed. But it's a good project, right? Like, just to give you a frame of reference, when we started talking about doing this first episode, I kind of put together a thesis, and then we kind of workshop it and kind of determine, where we agreed and whatnot. And then going back to the beginning, which we will ultimately circle back to, starts with Roswell. It really all starts there. But kind of summing up, again, a little bit further on the thesis, we talked about the creation of the Air Force, the CIA, I believe even the NSA was around 1947, which is, if you believe the government can't keep secrets, the NSA wasn't even publicly acknowledged or known about, at least until the 70s, I believe. And then even the NRO, which even most people nowadays doesn't even know exists, or what their purpose is again around that period of time. 1950, this is a kind of a key element here where I think, again, adds legitimacy to the topic. You got a Canadian inquiry by a gentleman, Wilbert Smith. He basically made inquiries throughout the Canadian embassy staff in Washington, D.C., and basically he got a few key phrases, and I can't remember exactly who his contact was or who provided him the memo. I feel it was Nathan Twining, but I could be way off on that. There's so many names here, and I'm terrible with names. But basically, Wilbert Smith, who was a Canadian, in his inquiry, he was established this information, which was given to him through diplomatic channels from the D.C. Basically, the matter is the most highly classified subject of the United States, rates even higher than the H-bomb, that flying saucers exist, as they were known at the time, and the MO of these objects, the phenomenon, UAP, UFOs, was unknown, but there was a concentrated effort being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. That name is important. Obviously, he was a Secretary of Defense during that period of time, but that name also pops up in the MJ-12 documents.
Yeah, a lot of these names that we will go over and that we are going to hear and we'll continue to hear are repeated over and over and over again. It's always the same people in the same fields.
Yeah.
And that's where we start talking about that compartmentalization, and then, or we start getting into like that MJ-12 or the control group or whatever. Regardless, a lot of these names are the same names that are always popping up. And some of those members are people who are alleged to be part of these control groups.
1952, you have Project Grudge ends, but it then becomes Project Blue Book because public hysteria at the time is quite high. People think they're being invaded by space aliens.
And that's the more notable of the projects is Project Blue Book. That's where more people are familiar.
Exactly. And retro, it's pretty easy to determine that was basically a PR campaign, especially when you look at the percentages of reports in there that were unidentified and basically the lack of follow-up, or I should say the lack of public follow-up on those unidentified ones. Really significant. 1952, in the summer, you have a famous incident that happens over the D.C. in the Capitol. where it's basically a fleet of several formations of craft that are flying over the Capitol building. Really significant. It's caught on film, and they picked them up on radar.
Scrambled jets to go after them.
Yeah. What that represents, it's anyone's guess. I mean, you could speculate till the cows come home, so to speak, but it won't really give you any answers. It's just a significant event, especially when you consider the location and the timing. 1953, you have a memo to the captain of Blue Book, Ed Ruppelt. There's some associated names with it that basically established there was also a top secret, ultra secret, well-funded group that was parallel to Blue Book that was investigating the phenomenon. So this is a recurring theme with the topic as well, is that there's a public stance and then there's a private stance. It's hard to kind of put yourself in the shoes 40, 50 years on when the public stance is one of outright denial, complete dismissal of the topic, complete denial of any existence of the objects themselves. I mean, there's those famous examples where J. Allen Hynek was kind of, I say forced to say, obviously he was his own man, but in his position as one who's professionally minded, I would speculate to say that he was nudged in the direction of giving explanations for things that he knew were likely not the case. I mean, there's a famous one of swamp gas, and the broad overarching kind of story arc of J. Allen Hynek is that he joins Blue Book as a skeptic, comes out as a believer. So the idea that there's a kind of parallel group to Blue Book that was really looking closely at this as opposed to trying to explain it away is extremely plausible. Also in this timeline, 1955 is when you first have the appearance or the creation of Area 51. Now, one's not to suggest that the creation of Area 51 was specifically to deal with recovered craft. That'd be a complete statement of ignorance regarding, again, the time, 1955. You're in the peak of the Cold War. You're obviously in an arms race with the Soviet Union. You're obviously having to develop new and better tech than them. You have famous planes and aircraft that come out of that era, the SR-71s, which held the flight speed record for the longest amount of time. It was developed in the 50s. You have the U-2, which was famously unknown until it was shot down over the Soviet Union.
We go all the way up to our modern bombers coming out of there and holding that secrecy. Was it the B-17 coming out of there, right?
F-117.
The F-117 coming out there, and the B-2, coming out of there, and they were basically held secret all the way up until their use.
Yeah.
Right? So
they revealed them in the late 80s in a really kind of fancy reveal.
But we know that this is Area 51 has primarily been a research and development location for new weapons, new technologies. That was where the Star Wars initiative was headed up, and so that was a big deal that we were pushing until that project was pulled. And so you can guarantee if it wasn't just one program, it was numerous programs, tons of programs coming out of there, some of which I can guarantee to this day still know nothing about and probably never will. There's programs that were nixed, but in some way were probably associated with other ones or whatever. And so those programs will just stay buried in the books and will never come to light. But so we can't make that assumption that Area 51 was for alien usage or a craft or whatever. But Area 51 becomes a very big deal. Yeah. And so
throughout the late 50s, your public interest continues to kind of expand. Again, like we've talked about ad nauseum, there's a strategy to dismiss and discredit the Blue Book. There was insistence of Project Blue Book, most likely due to Central Intelligence influence throughout the 50s and 60s, which is well documented. There's a real question, especially due to the illegality of CIA influence over kind of stateside media organizations, but that was something that's well documented for the 50s and 60s. Like we said earlier, Blue Book was obviously a public relations kind of exercise. They were mostly used as a concerted effort to explain away the sightings as prosaic. Ultimately, the 21% of their sightings were unidentified, which is exceptionally significant for the time. When you consider the development of computer tech and high-end aviation tech, you don't really have a real breakthrough until the 60s. There's also a purported event in Holloman Air Force Base in 1964. It's reported that there was a landing and engagement with some type of beings that happened there. There was presidential involvement. This is all alleged, but there's some interesting history around Holloman Air Force Base that kind of retains it in the UFO subconscious, UFO field, as a significant time or event.
I just want to interject real quick.
Yeah.
We were talking about the 21% of sightings within Project Blue Book. So to give you an idea of those numbers, there was 12,618 sightings in Project Blue Book that were documented, which that leaves 701 of them as being unidentified in the end.
Yeah, 701 unidentified, which is still about 200 more than was most recently acknowledged for the ODNI report that we just got a couple days ago.
You only need one.
Yep.
You only need one sighting to
Yep.
be that thing. That.
Oh, yeah, that was something that Stanton Friedman, one of the famous UFO researchers who passed a few years ago, I remember he had an interview where he had talked to the individual, and I forget the context, but it was basically associating the same thing. It's like, hey, we only need that one to be true. But anyway, that's why you look through all this mountain of data, is to kind of find that one that is undeniable. Again, the kind of turn of phrase that's always associated with this topic, the smoking gun. And in my opinion, with Roswell, we have a few kind of smoking guns. Again, moving forward, so you have your first congressional hearings in 1966. Again, nothing of note really comes of that. At some point during the 60s, likely near when FOIA was kind of introduced, 1967, likely due to, again, kind of mirroring our current time, the cultural upheaval. I think around this time, especially because of FOIA, is when you see possession of whatever exotic materials were recovered kind of turned over to private industry because they'd be exempt from FOIA. This is where you see companies like Lockheed or Northrop or Rand or any number of Bechtel or any other number of kind of defense contractors that, you know, really generate billions of dollars in revenue but are widely not known, Lockheed notwithstanding. And
suspiciously all attached to you, EG&G and things like that, and ET coming out of
EG&G is interesting, especially when we talk about specifically about Roswell. I know we keep teasing that, but we'll save that for that because I have a lot of notes from one of the books on EG&G. Blue Book ends in 1969, likely due to one of the famous early government reports, which was the Condon Report or the Condon Committee. It was alleged to have been a scientific study, quote unquote, that was contracted out by the Air Force to close the book on that topic, on UFOs once and for all. So basically they had a determined outcome before they even started the report. I believe it's Condon himself who had made a passing statement to someone whose name escapes me, but basically has said that there's nothing to the topic, but he's not supposed to come to that conclusion for another year. And then you have many more outright denials by the Air Force. Then again, this is kind of continuing our broad general thesis, is basically due to the expense of secrecy and understanding or lack thereof, the tech will be pulled out every several years or so to be re-examined. So if you can't make progress on something, no matter how much money you throw at it, you just throw it away in almost like a Raiders of the Lost Ark warehouse.
I'm not saying there is a warehouse,
exactly.
that it's not Warehouse 13 of just boxes full of alien technology sitting there, but this stuff, if you can't do anything with it, you put it away, and you wait for your own technology, your own advancements to catch up, and then you pull it back out and you see if you can make any headway into this. You know, if you can make any, you're not going to just throw it in the trash. You're going to see if you can make any headway and if you can make any progress towards it.
I think, again, your control group still exists. There's not progress being made. They'll probably convene, maybe annually or biannually. But I think there's a sense, and I think this is another theme that comes up with, when we talk about the control group, is that there's probably competing ideologies in that control group. There's one, keep it secret. There's one, people have a right to know. And I think that at this point, they might have come to an impasse and they sense, okay, look, this isn't going to be secret forever. There needs to be some form of cultural adaptation to this idea of there being more life beyond what was on Earth. Throughout the 50s and 60s, well, prior to the 60s, when you have your cultural upheaval, the hippie movement, and kind of the broadening of consciousness, likely due to the onset of psychedelics. Prior to that, you have a really conservative Christian country where it's very much almost fundamentalist in nature, where it's really cohesive around that singular theology. And so if there wasn't evidence to support that something beyond this planet existed or had engaged with us, there would definitely need to be a cultural adaptation to that. And this is where Holloman Air Force Base kind of comes into the picture again. This is a whole separate topic. One of the best researchers that speaks on this is Grant Cameron. Basically, he knows the story really, really well. There's a filmmaker. Basically, he gets approached by the Defense Department. They want to make a series of documentaries about Vietnam. And then they also throw him this pitch for one about UFOs, which he's kind of taken aback by. It's not anything the government has publicly acknowledged. It's really weird for the government to approach this filmmaker on this topic. He gets contracted to make this. They say, hey, we got this footage of the landing that happened in 1964. This guy, he sees the actual 16 millimeter film reel. He sees through it. There's, 800 feet of this film. Ultimately, in the end, as is always the tease with this topic, it's like only 8 seconds make it into the final documentary. If you want to find the documentary, it's called UFOs Past, Present, and Future, or its re-release title, UFOs It Has Begun. They're hosted by Sterling, the Twilight Zone guy, Roger Sterling. Really great. They're really unique, I think, in the history of the topic because it's one of the only documentaries I've seen other than History Channel's Unidentified, where they have Pentagon footage, not by Pentagon footage, like footage captured by Pentagon officials, but like footage from inside the Pentagon where there's interviewing somebody about this topic. It's really unprecedented at the time. They said they would provide footage of an alien that survived in 1949 crash and lived until 1952, where it died at Los Alamos, et cetera, et cetera. So it's always a big tease. Again, like I said, ultimately the 800 feet of film turns out to be 8 seconds of film. It's in the documentary, and it's kind of enhanced by artistic renditions of that Holloman Air Force Base engagement, which again kind of throws the idea out there, but it reels it back in from plausibility.
If I remember from the footage, it's you basically just see a glowing object come down over the mountains towards the base,
and then it cuts.
Yep. There's no, they don't zoom in on it. You
Nope.
can't tell, and even if it's such a distance that you can't tell anything besides this object is reflecting light. It's or it's putting off its own light. I would say my assumption would be that it's reflecting light, and that you're seeing something. So a metallic craft come over the mountain towards the base, and then the film's done.
Yeah, it's a common theme. I mean, the same thing happens with Gimbal Go Fast and Tic Tac, where just as the item, the craft is about to do something interesting, it cuts.
Yeah, we don't get to see the full footage.
No, I mean, like Gimbal, it starts to rotate, then it cuts. Tic Tac, it seems to shoot off to the left, and then it cuts. Go Fast as it's flying across the bottom of the water, and it cuts. There's a possibility that Go Fast isn't going as fast as it's kind of perceived just due to parallax and things like that. But anyway, so shortly after 1973, which is when the filmmaker Bob Emenegger, he's approached for this film topic. A little bit after that, now you get another famous story. Barry Goldwater, famous politician. He actually reached out to one of his contacts at Wright-Patterson, General Curtis LeMay, basically trying to find out more about the topic in general. And I'll quote here. He says, "I made an effort to find out what was in the building at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where the information was being stored that has been collected by the Air Force, and I was understandably denied this request. It is still classified above top secret." As the story goes, he calls up Curtis LeMay, who was a friend of his, who Mr. Goldwater references never really lost his temper. It seemed like a really mild-mannered dude. But when he asked him about this specifically, the guy loses his temper, tells him never to ask him about this topic ever again, slams the phone, and it becomes a moot point after that. So in the wake of Vietnam, FOIA is strengthened, and the public interest in UFOs continues to kind of remain significant. Post Blue Book, so in the early 70s, this is where your civilian organizations become relevant. There's several groups that are led by former U.S. government associates like Hynek and Donald Kehoe, who's still alive, NICAP and CUFOS, Center for UFO Studies, and the National Institute for something escapes me. NICAP, NICAP. I believe their archive is owned by somebody else now. They still have a website, and they have a lot of good information there.
National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena.
There you go. National Investigations Committee. Perfect. So at this point, the kind of government stance is that it's been laid. The government lays the topic to rest. Private organizations have kind of taken up the mantle. A lot of this thesis is really, to be frank, has been influenced by Rich Dolan, his two fantastic kind of compendiums, UFOs, the National Security State. He has 2 volumes. I hear he's working on a 3rd one. They're basically a compendium of every significant and plausible, almost documentable UFO engagement by military and government elements. So exceptionally important books with this topic. It comes from a historical perspective. He's a historian by training and education. Cannot recommend them enough. Also has a podcast, Intelligent Disclosure, really one of the top tier frontline legends of this field. You got international sightings. They continue. Stigma is also consistent. Stigma is still around. Aside from a few of those civilian organizations, nothing formal is being investigated. Now, this is kind of countered by behind-the-scenes information that comes out of FOIA papers, where it's clear that they're putting forward one message, but behind the scenes, there's an intense interest in the topic. 1977, you have Jimmy Carter, his UFO initiative. He was likely, this has become more of a recent discussion point. I think some people have been talking. I think it might have been even Dolan had a guest on to talk about the kind of minutia of what Carter might have been briefed on at the time. But chances are, and it's exceptionally likely, that it was actually briefed by a member of quote unquote the program, which is another, synonym for the control group, MJ-12, whatever you want to call it, but whatever group kind of manages this topic specifically.
It's important. Carter had a deep interest in UFOs.
Yeah,
Carter
had a sighting,
yeah. Mm-hmm. And it was him and a group of other people, he says about 10 to 12 other witnesses, witnessed a UFO in Georgia in 1969. And so during his presidential campaign in 76, he said, "I'm going to release every piece of UFO information available to the public." And then he didn't follow through. And when people called him on it, after a while, the response they got, which is our typical response, is national defense implications.
Yeah.
That is always that catch-all, that national defense implications.
And look, it's understandable. I mean, if you came across some type of high level tech that was the trump card for all other tech that anybody had access to, you would hold that so close to the chest. Like, it's completely understandable. But I think, at least my perspective is that there's a philosophical implication here to broaden the humanity's consciousness as a whole regarding its significance in the cosmos. Not to get too hippie on it, because I'm not, but like, I'm on team people one way or the other. Like, humans, yeah, we're too factional.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that you say that as the broadening consciousness, and because of the new Arrow reports, some people pulled up, they got a hold of one of the Arrow PDFs of their PowerPoints, and on that PowerPoint was the new logo, the new Arrow patch.
Yeah.
And so when you zoom in on it, there's Latin writing on it, and it talks about how the universe is changing, and how we need to basically broaden the consciousness. That our thoughts is what is there, and so it's kind of interesting that you say that, the broadening of the consciousness. But
for sure.
So go ahead, Dale.
So Carter's initiative, he's likely briefed on it. As the story goes, some people say he wept after the briefing, and then he ended up not talking about it publicly ever again. Chances are, based on, I think it was that Dolan interview again, it was like maybe a week or two ago, so late 2022 or so. I think it's more like he was just kind of overwhelmed by the topic, and maybe not weeping, maybe more of a head in hands. But anyway, that's minutia. So that's about 1977. 1978, Stanton Friedman, he comes across Jesse Marcel. I'm not going to talk about that right now. That's more Roswell, but that is significant. So around the 80s, this has been about 20 years since the materials have been kind of shelved, most likely. This is when they start kind of re-examining it. So 20 years of technological development since about the 60s. Obviously, that's 20 years. And I think that's when they start kind of looking at it with new tech. And this is where the topic, again, starts ramping up. A lot more people start popping up saying they know things. This is also 1980s when you have the first real book on Roswell Incident by Charles Berlitz and William Bill Moore. It basically reignited interest in the topic. It kind of been waning. It kind of got relegated to the fringe. But that book became really, really big and a big influence on a broader audience. This is where you start getting into MJ12, which basically, a very cursory examination, they come across a document in the archives called the Eisenhower Briefing Document, if I got my names correct. Bill Moore's compatriot, Jamie Chandray, who was a film producer from LA, gets a film reel in the mail, and it's got pictures of physical papers of a lot more of these documents. It's, again, with this topic, it's one bit of tease with a whole lot of unsubstantiated, so you can't determine the provenance of them, you can't determine the origin, which, again, ironically, is exactly how, if you were kind of revealing classified information, is like, that's exactly what you'd want to do. You couldn't give them physical documentation that could be traced. You have like several layers of disconnect from the actual origin. This is where you start seeing more disinformation getting ramped up. It starts to muddy the waters and maintain the ridicule factor. Bill Moore himself was engaged by Defense Department individuals, and he actually reveals this in 1989, where he was like, hey, I was physically given disinformation to mislead elements of the UFO field. And then after this kind of outrageous presentation at MUFON, and admirably, his integrity to say that he engaged in this was just more to say than some people. He disappears from the field completely. He did a couple interviews in the late 2000s, early 2010s with Greg Bishop on Radio Misterioso. I don't know if you could find archive versions of them anymore. I have a few that I have saved on my computer. They're really interesting to kind of hear him speak retrospectively on that era and kind of his engagement and more of his theories and things like that, and kind of what he's up to now, because he was really significant for that topic at the time. I mean, he basically, along with Berlitz and Friedman, who was a kind of shadow contributor to that book, blew this topic up. So you have Disinfo in the 80s. 1988 is another really interesting documentary TV program. It was called UFO Cover Up Live. It actually is the first public mention of Area 51 anywhere. It's just thrown away on a flowchart. MJ12 was thrown on there. And it's just kind of acknowledged as being, this is how the UFO cover-up works, right?
Does it label it as Area 51 specifically?
Yeah, it's called Area 51, and nobody knew what the hell that was at the time. And when you go back and look at it in context, it's really kind of telling. It wouldn't be the first time that there's been some type of control group involvement in trying to kind of broach the topic. This is something that Grant Cameron has spoken about before, where he's like, the government disclosure effort is primarily about throwing some information out there and then reeling it back in with either deniability or someone like Lazar, who doesn't have any credibility in most circles. But oddly enough, some of what he talked about at the time has been substantiated as time goes on, whether it be, and I'm not a chemist, but his description of element 115, which wasn't ultimately synthesized until the mid to late 2000s, and even his physical description of the way the craft moved, where they would turn up on its belly, focus the gravity amplifiers, and zip off into space. It's oddly consistent with what you see in Gimbal. So you can't completely dismiss that guy yet, which brings us to Lazar. Me personally, I'm inclined to believe him. It's more of an intuition than it is something like, oh, he's 100% authentic. Here's the smoking gun for X, X, and X. He obviously has a lot of problems with his history, a lot of things he hasn't said publicly, so I can't substantiate one way or the other what those have been. But a lot of people that are credible continue to believe him, whether it be George Knapp, who I believe to be exceptionally credible, or even mainstream personalities like Joe Rogan. All those types of characters will really
I'm going
stand
to give him
behind
like
him.
a 90% rating.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I mean, I think the
is.
biggest problem with Lazar is going to be his education history. I have some personal theories on how that is kind of irrelevant for the time
We'll get into it eventually.
at some point. So you got Lazar in the 90s, and then you have some mainstream interest. Mainstream interest continues to intensify. I consider myself in the same group when you have shows like Dark Skies or The X-Files, and then movies like Independence Day. All those types of things are real cultural touchstones for this type of thing where it gets people interested. I know I was there as well. Independence Day was also super influential, where they had a really killer marketing campaign for the time. It was real mysterious, and then they just kind of approached things very kind of matter of fact. Like, hey, no, the stuff is at Area 51. That's where the alien stuff is at. Real important. Phoenix Lights, another significant incident in 1997. I kind of go multiple ways on this. It could be something anomalous, but I also just recently came across something where these really interesting blimps that were really like gargantuan in size could float silently over large areas. Doesn't really describe the lights, and it would describe the dismissal of military personnel and the engagement of National Guard forces, Air National Guard forces later that would drop flares that were what you see on film. But a lot of people saw something physical that blocked out the stars,
Including Kurt Russell.
including Kurt Russell.
So if anybody knows Kurt Russell, we want him on the show.
Yeah, exactly. Kurt Russell, the governor, Fife Symington, who's not without controversy himself. He was in the heat of political controversy at the time. And now we get to the late 90s. Late 90s, you have the Roswell report by the Air Force. Basically, they claim, and this is kind of long-standing dismissal of the explanation of this event, is that they say it was a mogul spy balloon rather than a weather balloon, and that the bodies recovered are crash dummies, and it still kind of left the topic with a lot of ridicule. Crash dummies weren't used until like 1952, and the mogul spy balloon, there was no reason to keep it secret for that long. Now, look, that could be typical bureaucratic bullshit where it just takes too long to reveal it, but the physical description of a mogul spy balloon wasn't much different than a typical weather balloon. You just had a longer trail of radar reflectors and some technological devices, but nothing that was consistent with physical descriptions of the crash itself. So after that kind of overarching thesis, it all kind of comes back to Roswell with that final dismissal in the late 90s from the Air Force. It doesn't really fit the evidence.
Well, that's where we're going to take off for this episode. In episode 1, we took an introduction into the Not Top Secret podcast and who we are. We also kind of give a brief description into the Roswell incident. And in episode 2, we're going to take a deep dive into that incident. We're going to find out just why people believe that there was a government cover-up and why it is still a controversial subject to this day. Obviously, as this is episode 1, we are completely new to this. So if you have any questions, comments, feedback that you could give us, it'd be greatly appreciated. If you could also like, subscribe, and download our podcast or share it with somebody that you might think may be interested. And thank you again for joining us on Not Top Secret. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Not Top Secret. We hope you enjoyed the show and learned something new. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. We'll be back with another episode packed with fascinating information, secrets, and weirdness. Until then, stay curious, ask the hard questions, and keep your eyes on the sky. Welcome to Not Top Secret, a podcast about all things paranormal.